You lock your door every night. You check it twice, maybe 3 times if you're the anxious type. You close the blinds. You turn off the lights. And for a few hours, you let yourself believe that this room, this small, 4-walled box, belongs only to you. That belief is the most fragile thing you own. Tonight's episode isn't about ghosts. It isn't about demons or curses or things that shouldn't exist. It's about something far worse, because it's something that's already been proven to exist. People, real people, who slip into the spaces we never think to check, behind drywall, beneath floorboards, in the 6 inches of dead air between an apartment and the one next door, and stay there, sometimes for days, sometimes for months, sometimes, if the reports are to be believed, for years. There's a term for one version of this.
It's called frogging, when a stranger secretly moves into someone else's home, living in an attic, a crawl space, an unused room, surviving off scraps and silence, watching the family go about their lives without ever being seen. Police reports on frogging cases exist. Housing inspectors have found evidence of it in the walls of occupied homes. It's rare, but it's real. And rare is not the same as impossible. Tonight we have 3 stories. Each one starts small. A sound in the wall, a door that doesn't quite close right, a feeling you can't explain. And each one gets worse, much worse. If you live alone, you might want to check your locks before we start. If you live with someone, ask yourself, how well do you actually know every square foot of the place you sleep in?
Mara Delgado had lived in the same 1-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of the Ashgrove building for 2 years before she heard the first sound. It was a scratching. Not the frantic scrabble of a mouse. She knew that sound, had dealt with it in her first month in the building, back when the landlord still answered his phone. This was slower, deliberate, a dragging noise, like fingernails pulled with intention across metal, coming from somewhere behind the vent grate above her closet. She told herself it was the building settling. Old buildings did that. The Ashgrove had been converted from a textile factory sometime in the 1920s, and everyone on her floor complained about something. Pipes groaning, floors creaking, the elevator that shuddered like it was breathing. A little scratching in the vents didn't seem worth a maintenance call. It happened again 3 nights later.
This time, it lasted almost 20 minutes. And twice during those 20 minutes, it stopped completely. The kind of stopping that felt less like silence and more like listening. Mara sat up in bed that night with her phone flashlight pointed at the vent grate, heart going hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. Nothing happened. The scratching didn't resume. Eventually, she told herself she'd imagined the pause, that sounds don't listen, and she went back to sleep with the lamp on. By the 4th week, she'd started keeping a log on her phone, dates, times, duration. Her friend, Priya, a nurse who worked nights and slept during the day, thought it was funny at first. You're basically doing a haunting spreadsheet. Until Mara read a few entries aloud, and Priya's laugh got thinner each time. 12:41 a.m. Sound lasted 6 minutes. Direction, closet vent, moving toward bedroom vent. 12:58. Silence.
1 a.m. Resumed from bedroom vent, moving back toward closet. It's moving, Priya said slowly, like it's going somewhere. Mara laughed it off. Raccoons could get into old duct systems, she said. Or maybe pigeons had made a nest and something living was in there scavenging. She wanted a mundane answer badly enough that she almost convinced herself of it. She even called an exterminator, who came, ran a camera scope into the largest vent opening he could access, and found nothing. No nest, no droppings, no sign of any animal at all. He shrugged,
told her ductwork sometimes made noise from temperature changes, and left. The sounds continued. And then, in the 6th week, they started following a pattern that had nothing to do with temperature. They only happened when she was home. Never during the day when she was at work. Never on the 2 nights she stayed at her sister's place across town. She checked, lying awake there too, listening for a sound that never came. Only ever at night. Only ever in her apartment. And she began to notice this with a creeping, sick certainty. Only ever when the lights were off and she was in bed. It was as if something needed the dark and her stillness to move at all. The night everything changed, Mara had fallen asleep with a true crime podcast playing low in her earbuds, one bud fallen out onto the pillow. She woke somewhere around 3 a.m. to a sound that wasn't scratching. It was a soft, metallic groan, the specific creak of a hinge that hadn't been oiled, and it was coming from inside her closet. She lay frozen, telling herself it was the vent grate flexing with the building's temperature, that same excuse she'd been feeding herself for 6 weeks, until she heard something that no amount of denial could explain away. The unmistakable click of a latch, followed by 3 soft, careful footsteps on the closet floor. Her closet had no door on the inside. There was nowhere for footsteps to be except real ones, on real floorboards, made by something with weight. Mara didn't move, didn't breathe, or tried not to. Through the crack of her bedroom door, in the gray wash of streetlight from the window, she watched the closet door, which she was certain she'd left shut, ease open, perhaps 4 inches, no further, just enough for whatever was behind it to see out. She would later tell police she didn't know how long she lay there, rigid, playing dead in her own bed, while something watched her from 4 inches of open darkness. It felt like an hour. It was probably closer to 10 minutes. Eventually, impossibly slowly, the door eased shut again. She heard the same soft footsteps retreat. Then a scraping sound as something, a panel she'd learn later, was dragged back into place. Then, nothing. She did not sleep again that night. At 6 a.m., the moment the sky started to lighten, she left the apartment, called a locksmith, and did not go back inside alone. What the building super found, once Mara insisted, screamed, really, in the leasing office until someone finally listened, was this: a false panel at the back of her closet, disguised behind a shelving unit that had come with the apartment, that led into a narrow crawl space running behind the wall. That crawl space connected, through a gap no wider than a manhole cover, to the utility shaft that served the whole floor. And from there, if a person was slim enough and patient enough, they could access an identical panel in the apartment next door. Apartment 3B, occupied for the past 8 months by a quiet, unremarkable man named Dennis Ott, who paid his rent on time and who nobody, including Mara, could remember ever actually holding a conversation with. Police found a sleeping bag in the crawl space, a flashlight with the batteries worn dead, food wrappers, a notebook, water-damaged and mostly illegible, except for a handful of pages near the back that were not. Pages with dates, times, and Mara's name written over and over in handwriting that grew smaller and more cramped the further you went, as if the writer had been trying to take up less space in the world with every entry. Ott was gone by the time police searched 3B. His apartment was left almost bare. No photographs, minimal furniture, a mattress on the floor. He had rented it under a name that turned out to be false. He has never been found. Mara moved out within the week. She still keeps a light on when she sleeps, in every apartment she's lived in since. And she has never, not once, kept a bedroom that shares a wall with a closet again. The Whitfield family had lived in their house on Larch Hollow Road for 11 years when they found the door that wasn't supposed to be there. It started, as these things so often do, with something as mundane as a broken washing machine. Renovating the basement laundry room meant tearing out an old section of drywall that had bulged with water damage for years. The kind of cosmetic problem homeowners live with because fixing it always seems to sit at the bottom of a very long list. Tom Whitfield, armed with a crowbar and a Saturday afternoon, expected to find mold, maybe some old wiring. What he found instead was a door. It was a plain door, unpainted, set into a frame that had clearly been built after the house itself. The studs around it were newer lumber, cut and fitted by someone who knew what they were doing. It had no handle on this side, only a small round hole where a handle should have gone, the kind you could just barely fit 2 fingers into and pull. Tom called his wife Renata down to look at it before he touched anything else. They stood there for a long moment, the way you do when a house you've lived in for over a decade suddenly stops feeling entirely known. "Maybe it's just a crawl space," Renata said. "Old houses have those. Storage." It wasn't storage. When Tom finally pried the door open, it stuck, swollen with humidity, and gave way all at once with a groan that echoed through the empty basement. The smell hit them before anything else did. Not decay, exactly. Something closer to the smell of a rarely washed body in a small space. Sweat, mildew, and underneath it, faintly, cigarette smoke. Though neither Whitfield smoked and never had. The room beyond the door was maybe 8 feet by 6, windowless, walled in unfinished plywood. And it was, unmistakably, lived in. There was a cot against one wall, blankets balled up at the foot of it, a battery-powered lantern, its charge long dead.
Stacks of paperback novels, dog-eared and swollen with damp, arranged in careful, almost obsessive piles by size. A 5-gallon bucket in the corner that Renata refused to get close enough to identify with certainty, though its purpose was not hard to guess. And on the wall, opposite the cot, in careful block letters written directly onto the plywood in what looked like permanent marker, a tally, hundreds of marks, grouped in rows of 5, running the length of the wall and continuing on to the next. Tom counted later, sitting on the basement stairs with his hands shaking too badly to hold his phone steady enough to photograph it properly. 411 marks. If each one represented a day, that was over a year. The house had been built in the 1970s, sold twice before the Whitfields bought it, and as far as any record showed, no permit had ever been filed for a basement addition. Whoever built this room had built it without anyone's knowledge or permission, which meant it had either been there since before the Whitfields moved in, and someone had lived in it undetected for over a decade of tenancy changes, or, far worse, someone had built it and moved in after the Whitfields themselves had settled into the house. The second possibility became a horrifying certainty 3 days later, when Renata found a small stack of photographs tucked behind a loose plywood panel near the cot. They were photographs of the Whitfield family. Taken through a gap, investigators would later determine it corresponded to a knot in the wood, no bigger than a coin, that opened directly onto the underside of the living room floor, where a matching gap in the subfloor let a sliver of light and sound pass through. Photographs of their daughter Kayla doing homework at the kitchen table. Photographs of Tom asleep in his recliner. Photographs dated across a span of nearly 2 years of ordinary evenings the family had no idea anyone had witnessed. Detective Sarah Muñez, who caught the case, told local reporters it was one of the most disturbing scenes she'd encountered in 15 years on the force. Not because of violence, since none had occurred, but because of the sheer, patient, invisible violation of it. "Someone lived under this family's feet," she said. "Ate what they could scavenge or steal in small enough amounts not to be noticed, and watched them live their lives for 2 years. That takes a kind of discipline that should frighten everyone. Small thefts, once the family started reconstructing the timeline, suddenly made a horrible kind of sense. Renata had always assumed she was misplacing things. A box of crackers gone quicker than expected. A phone charger that vanished and reappeared weeks later in a different room. Batteries missing from the junk drawer. Kayla, 12 at the time, had complained for months that someone moved her books around in her room while she was at school. A complaint her parents had gently dismissed as an overactive imagination. No one was ever caught. Fingerprints recovered from the hidden room didn't match anyone in any accessible database. The tally marks stopped, per the final row, 11 days before the Whitfields tore out the drywall, which meant that whoever had been living beneath their house for over a year had, for reasons no one has ever explained, simply stopped counting and, presumably, left less than 2 weeks before they were discovered. Or perhaps they hadn't left at all and simply stopped needing to count the days for some other reason. The Whitfields sold the house within 6 months, at a significant loss, to a buyer who was told, per legal requirement, about the discovery in the basement. They still don't know who was watching them, for how long, or where that person is now. Renata has said, in the one interview she agreed to give, that the hardest part wasn't the fear. It was going back in her memory through every evening of those 2 years, every argument, every private moment, every night she thought she and her family were completely alone, and realizing that in her own home, she never once actually was.
Elias Voss noticed the first mark on a Tuesday, though he wouldn't understand what he was looking at for another 3 weeks. It was small, a faint smudge on the brass rim of his apartment's peephole, the kind of thing you'd wipe away with a sleeve and never think about again. He did exactly that. Wiped it, forgot it, went to bed. The following week, there was another, slightly darker this time, a thin crescent shape pressed into the brass like something had been held against it, close and still, for long enough to leave an impression of oil and skin. Elias lived alone in a small corner unit at the end of a 4th-floor hallway, the kind of apartment building where neighbors nodded at each other in the elevator, but rarely learned names. He didn't think much of the second mark either. Buildings were dirty. People touched things. It was the 3rd week that broke the pattern of dismissal, because that was the week he started hearing it. Not a knock.
Not footsteps, not even breathing, not really, just the faintest, almost imperceptible sound of contact. A soft, dense hush against the wood of his front door. The kind of sound a cheek makes resting against a surface. He heard it first at 1:47 a.m., lying in bed with the lights off, and told himself it was the building. He heard it again the next night at almost exactly the same time, and this time he got up. He didn't open the door. Some instinct, older and smarter than his conscious mind, told him not to. Instead, he crept to the peephole and looked out, expecting the empty, fish-eyed hallway he saw every time he checked his mail. The hallway light directly outside his door was out. Not dim, out. Every other light down the corridor burned its usual sickly fluorescent white, but the one bulb positioned squarely above his own doorway sat dark, and in the pooled shadow beneath it, Elias could just make out a shape, still upright. Close enough to the door that its edges blurred into darkness he couldn't separate from the doorframe itself. He stood at that peephole for almost 40 minutes, not daring to move, watching a shape that did not move either, until at 2:31 a.m. it simply wasn't there anymore. No sound of departure, no footsteps down the hall. It was there, and then, between one look and the next, it wasn't. Elias called the building super the next morning, reported the dead hallway bulb, and was told it had been replaced only 2 weeks prior and should still have most of its life left. The super changed it anyway.
That night, at 1:52 a.m., the soft hush against his door returned. And when Elias checked the peephole, the bulb was out again, and the shape was back, standing in precisely the same spot as before. Close enough now that he could see, or thought he could see, the faint outline of a head tilted slightly, as if listening for something on the other side. He did not sleep in that apartment again. He moved a chair to the hallway of his sister's place for 3 nights before he found the courage to go back. And when he did, he brought a friend, a set of new deadbolts, and a hardware store trail camera, which he mounted inside a decorative wall sconce facing his own front door. The footage, when he finally reviewed it, after 4 consecutive nights of the same 1:47 a.m. sound, showed a figure, male, tall, wearing dark clothing that gave almost no useful detail, approaching the door from the stairwell end of the hallway with a slow, unhurried gait that Elias found somehow more disturbing than urgency would have been. The figure would stop directly in front of Elias's door, reach up without any visible tool, and simply unscrew the hallway bulb by hand. 3 careful turns until it went dark, and then it would stand there, not moving, not trying the handle, not doing anything except standing, face inches from the wood, for exactly the length of time, Elias timed it against the footage, that matched every disturbance he'd recorded in his sleep log. 41 minutes. Every single night. 41 minutes, then gone.
He took the footage to the police, who opened a file, interviewed a few neighbors, and got nowhere. The figure's face was never visible on camera, angled down in a way, with what felt chillingly like deliberate awareness of where the lens was pointed. The building's other residents, when asked, mostly shrugged. A few admitted to hearing something in the hallway some nights, but had assumed it was another tenant coming home late. One neighbor, an elderly woman 2 doors down, named Mrs. Okafor, told Elias something that he has never quite been able to shake. She said that for the better part of a year before he moved in, she used to hear the same soft sound outside her own door at almost exactly the same time each night. She'd assumed, she said, that it was nothing. Wind. Pipes. She'd never once gotten up to check. I just thought, she told them, not quite meeting his eyes, that it wasn't my business to look. Elias moved out 3 weeks later.
He never learned who the figure was, why it chose his door specifically, or where, if anywhere, it went once he left. But he still, more than a year later, cannot fall asleep without first checking that his front door is not just locked, but genuinely, physically alone on the other side. He has developed a habit he can't break. Right before bed, every night, without fail, he presses his eye to the peephole and looks. He has never told anyone what he's afraid he might one day see looking back. 3 stories, 3 homes, 3 families who believed, the way we all do, that the walls around them meant safety. If there's a thread running through all of it, it's this. The danger in these stories was never loud. It never announced itself. It lived in the pause between sounds, in the small missing objects you explained away, in the mark on a peephole you wiped clean without a second thought. The scariest part of a secret neighbor story isn't the moment of discovery. It's every single ordinary night that came before it. The nights you slept soundly, certain you were alone while you weren't. So tonight, before you turn off this video and turn off your lights, check your vents, check your closets, check the space behind that shelf you've never moved. And if you hear something tonight that you can't quite explain, don't tell yourself it's nothing. Sleep well, if you can.